$28 million. That is how much this pair of shoes from the 1939 movie The Wizard of Oz just got sold for at an auction, making it by far the most expensive piece of film memorabilia ever. And if you're wondering why, you're in for a story.
The ruby slippers are still locked away as FBI evidence.
13 years after they were stolen.
I have to keep the shoes in a bank vault.
Maybe the most iconic cinematic prop or costume in movie history.
There's something about those slippers that people love.
But questions still remain.
I mean, we weren't told anything about these shoes.
It was almost a perfect storm.
So, how much are you going to get for these things?
Well,
something happened to me that day.
Who's at $7 million?
And I knew
$16 million.
that I had to own
$27 million.
The ruby slippers.
It turned into a nightmare.
Ladies and gentlemen, the ruby slippers just sold for $28 million. I'm telling you, there are so many twists to this plot. And some people will tell that story.
Alright, so the first important piece of this puzzle takes us all the way back to 1938. It was a time of widespread economic struggle, the Great Depression. Bear with me. Unemployment rate was historically high, and considering all the poverty and hardship, you would assume that going to the movies was not really something people did much of, but the data might surprise you. On average, a staggering 65% of Americans went to the movie theater at least once per week every single week, a number that is borderline unimaginable today. The reason, other than the price being actually affordable, was that movies provided an escape. They allowed people to forget about reality for an hour. Some historians are even crediting cinema as one of those things that helped us get through that difficult time, and as a result, the film industry was booming. The studios were releasing more movies than ever, operating almost like an assembly line, making them quickly, cheaply and efficiently, and yet no one was willing to invest anything significant into a movie meant for children. It was simply not a lucrative business, or at least that's what they thought, because when Disney released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, their first feature-length animated film, not only was it a huge commercial and critical success, but against all odds had managed to become the highest grossing movie of the year. So for Hollywood, the message was clear: high risk, high reward. Seeing that there is in fact an interest for the fantasy genre, MGM decided to go all in. They purchased the rights for The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and immediately began working on a film adaptation, giving it a budget of $2.8 million, which was astronomically high and almost unprecedented at the time.
They didn't want to do that, believe me, to spend that much money, because there was a lot of money in those days. They almost fired me for spending so much money.
To say they were ambitious with it would be an understatement. From the elaborate sets to costumes, special effects and hundreds of people involved, they spared no expense, and on top of that, it was going to be shot using the latest Technicolor technology. That alone was going to be a major selling point, as most movies at the time were still being released in black and white, so Louis B. Mayer, who was the powerful studio executive overseeing the whole production, insisted on taking advantage of color in every way possible. So a few changes were made, and one of them was to turn the magical slippers from silver, as they're in the novel, into a shiny red color, giving them even more of a contrast against the yellow brick road. They were now supposed to be made from ruby gemstones, and the person tasked with actually bringing them to life was the legendary designer Gilbert Adrian, who had single-handedly created some of the most iconic costumes for the biggest stars in the golden age of Hollywood. I mean, you know you've reached a certain level when you can go by one name only in the credits. Initially, he experimented with an Arabian-inspired folklore motif, but after a screen test, decided on a more simple design to better fit the humble farm girl image of Dorothy. The slippers themselves, that remember are now worth tens of millions, cost about $13 to make at the time, and to give them that shiny magical ruby effect, he used nothing more than just cheap regular materials like sequins, bungle beads and rhinestone.
Places, everybody!
Quiet, please.
Speed!
Playback.
1, 2, 3.
By the summer of 1939, it had generated a lot of buzz, and since it was so expensive to make, there was an immense amount of pressure to make profit. So MGM had no choice but to double down on a massive marketing campaign. For a brief period of time, The Wizard of Oz was everywhere. News and film magazines, events, public appearances, interviews, and a nationwide tour, making it one of the most anticipated film releases up until that point. Now, on paper, this movie should have been a disaster, but somehow, despite all the trouble, they managed to pull off a hit. From the iconic transition to color to the impressive practical effects, the great songs, performances, visuals, it just worked, and both the critics and the audience loved it. The following year, it won 3 Oscars at the Academy Awards, including an honorary one for Judy Garland, and although it did not make a profit, it was considered a satisfactory success for the studio. And that was kind of it. Other than the occasional re-release for a special anniversary, people had largely moved on. And as for the Ruby Slippers, they would spend the next 30 years gathering dust in storage. Not because they were valuable, but quite the opposite actually. Because they were considered a worthless piece of junk. Believe it or not, the studios back then could not care less about the props and costumes from the movies they were making. To them, once they've served their purpose on camera, they were just stuff, wasting valuable space in the backlot. It was an open secret in the industry that crew members could just take whatever they wanted home as souvenirs, and what's even more, plenty of film memorabilia ended up in the trash. By the 1960s, the old studio system was collapsing, and MGM, the once powerhouse of Hollywood, was in deep financial trouble, leading to the entire studio and all of its assets being sold to a financier named Kirk Kerkorian. He bought it not because he was particularly interested in the movie business, much less in preserving its history, but because of the land those backlots were built on, which was going to make for a prime real estate. There was only one problem though. The sound stages in those backlots were used as storage by MGM and were full of props, costumes, furniture, and all kinds of items from over 50 years of filmmaking. We're talking over 350,000 individual pieces spread across 7 giant warehouses. Eager to get rid of them and not waste any time, the solution was simple. He just sold everything in there to a veteran auctioneer, David Wise, and sort of let him deal with it. The price was for $1.5 million, which might sound like a lot, but it's crazy cheap, and the majority of it was for the bigger items like an actual airplane, ships, tanks, and all kinds of vehicles. David Wise, who had a lot of experience with liquidations, was confident that he could sell those machines, but when it came to the wardrobe, it was a bit of an afterthought. For whatever reason though, he had the hunch that some of those things might have a celebrity value, so he decided to set up a celebrity wardrobe auction, and due to the sheer amount of items, it was going to be the largest auction in Hollywood history, lasting for almost an entire month. But in order to make it happen, he would have to organize and categorize hundreds of thousands of separate pieces without knowing much about them, so he needed help, which finally leads us to the key person of the story. Kent Warner. Ever since he was a child, Kent Warner had been a huge fan of the golden age of Hollywood and possessed an impressive, almost encyclopedic amount of knowledge about the movies and stars from that period. He'd spent most of his time obsessing over the beautiful costumes from the movies, and because of that passion, he moved to Los Angeles in his early 20s, where he managed to find work in a costume house. It was supposed to be his dream job. The costume house had just acquired the wardrobe department of an old film studio, and his first task was to go there and see what they could rent out, but upon his arrival, he was shocked. What he saw was historic pieces left to rot, being used as rugs, and if something was deemed too recognizable to rent, the instructions was to simply throw it out.
When Kent Warner went in there, he found true Hollywood treasures that he couldn't stand to see items thrown away.
So as he was doing the job and cataloging the articles, he made it his mission to save as many of them as possible. As a film buff, he could recognize the important ones, and in order to rescue them, he would take them home with him. He would even go as far as to check the dumpsters in the studios because he knew they were throwing things out. As the years went by, his private collection grew, and as a costumer, he had an unlimited access to each of the studio's wardrobe departments. Eventually, he started selling some of those items directly from the trunk of his car, and essentially single-handedly created an underground black market for film memorabilia. In other words, he was stealing. But in his eyes and many others, it was film preservation. According to his friends, he referred to himself as Lana Lift, or the Robin Hood of memorabilia, and slowly but surely he grew a small community of private collectors. Which brings us back to 1970, the year of the big MGM auction. He knew that they were going to need a lot of help with sorting everything out, so he volunteered to do it for free. As far as they were aware. He had, of course, his hidden agenda, but he wasn't the only one either. A lot of MGM employees were trying to salvage whatever they could because anything that was deemed as not auctionable was going to be thrown out.
From grips to painters to office workers who were at the MGM lot for years tried to pick things out of the trash. It was the most sad and distressing kind of feel that all this wonderful treasure would be pulled out, and what would be their fate?
As he was helping out, he was always on the lookout for items with historic value. But from the very beginning, out of those hundreds of thousands of things, his biggest priority was to find the ruby slippers. See, like many people at the time, Kent Warner had been a huge fan of Judy Garland.
She became almost an icon, especially in the gay community, mainly because so many people knew of her childhood, her unhappy childhood, the way she had been used by people, and a lot of young fellows identified with that, and of course her great talent.
He practically idolized her, and considering she had recently tragically passed away, everything about her career became extra sentimental. On top of that, The Wizard of Oz had experienced a big resurgence in popularity. Millions of people were watching it on TV every single year, and many had realized the impact it had on cinema. Furthermore, as opposed to other props that were just shown on camera, the ruby slippers were an integral part of the plot. Kent Warner knew they were going to be important, so he made it his mission to find them, but unfortunately, it's been 30 years since the production. The studio kept no records of inventory, and for all he knew, they could have been lost forever.
Kent was probably the only person who had the patience, the discipline, the knowledge, and the passion to go through the MGM costume inventory. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of items.
After weeks of searching, one day he finally found them, and as a reward of sorts, he got to be the one to present them on stage during the auction. Astonishingly, the shoes sold for $15,000, immediately making them the most expensive piece of film memorabilia. The newspapers went crazy. Everybody was surprised. But perhaps the person most surprised was a certain lady from Memphis, because how could they sell the slippers if she was the one who had them?
I had no idea, and I didn't at that time know how many pairs were out there.
Suddenly, there was a nationwide mystery. On one side, there was Roberta Bauman, who had won the slippers from a film club contest all the way back in 1940 when she was 16 years old and had kept them in a shoebox in her closet ever since. And on the other side, an anonymous millionaire who believed he paid a lot of money for the only pair of slippers.
He was then assured by the auctioneer that those were the only pair, and led to believe, maybe by the auctioneer, that Roberta Bauman's pair was fake.
I did not get a reply as to whether my shoes were the real shoes that Judy Garland wore.
They both wanted answers, but nobody seemed to have any, except, of course, for Kent Warner. As it turns out, during that fateful day when he finally found the slippers, he didn't just find one pair, but several. We will never know how many exactly, as he publicly said it's a secret he'll take to the grave. But what we know for a fact is that at the very least he found 4. And it makes sense. It is a standard practice in the film business to make multiple versions of a prop in case one of them breaks during production. On top of that, different pairs were made for different purposes. One of them, for example, was primarily used for close-ups, and another one had an orange felt on the bottom so it would make less noise during the dancing scenes. And here, the story gets really interesting, because all of those pairs would go on to have a story of their own, and we'll trace all of them, leading to the one that just got sold for $28 million. The first was the initial test design that never made the cut, the so-called Arabian pair. As you'll see, they all have nicknames, and this one Kent Warner sold for an undisclosed amount to his friend and actress Debbie Reynolds.
So he sent over these slippers to me, and they never came up for auction. He simply brought them home, I suppose. He's since gone, so I can say that.
A vivid collector and just as passionate about preserving memorabilia, she intended to build a Hollywood film history museum and also bought a ton of other stuff at that 1970 auction. The Arabian pair was a part of her collection until 2011, when it was sold for $510,000 and its current whereabouts are unknown. The second pair, and the one in the worst condition, was the slippers he gave to the auction. Apparently, when he told them that he found the ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz, they simply didn't ask if there are any others. He did not lie, he let them assume. But nonetheless, they were sold at the auction for $15,000. Perhaps because he realized they're not the only ones, or because of their cultural significance, the anonymous millionaire who had bought them decided to donate them to the Smithsonian Institution in 1979. Ever since, they've been on display at the National Museum of American History and are easily one of the most popular exhibits in there, attracting millions of people every single year. They've been nicknamed the People's Shoes, and recently the museum had to raise $300,000 to help prevent their deterioration and are now kept in a sealed display case under very special conditions.
We're really freezing them in time right now so that we don't alter the future, but we just preserve the present.
The third pair, and the one in the best condition, Kent Warner kept for himself. It's nicknamed the Witch's Shoes as it's believed to be the pair they used for some of the most iconic close-ups in the movie. He kept it as a part of his collection for a decade, but once his health condition worsened and the police had started to crack down on the underground market, he decided it was time to part ways and sold them to an unknown buyer through an auction house for just $12,000.
He loved those shoes so much. I would have thought that only something really serious would ever cause him to sell them.
Years later, they got sold again, but this time for $165,000 to an art dealer, Phillips Samuels, who's been trying to get his hands on them for a while. He displayed them behind a bulletproof glass in his gallery and would often use them to help fund children's charities. In 2011, it was announced that the slippers would go on auction, and Leonardo DiCaprio, together with Steven Spielberg and a bunch of other Hollywood benefactors, paid an undisclosed amount, but reportedly at least $2 million, to buy them and donate them to the newly built Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, where they still reside to this day as a part of different exhibitions. The fourth pair is the one that Roberta Bauman had won from that film contest in 1940. After owning them for decades and showing them off to children in local libraries, she decided to put them for an auction. In 1988, after a heated bidding war, they were sold to a lifelong Judy Garland fan called Anthony Landini, who bought them for $165,000, once again making them the most expensive piece of film memorabilia ever. And after buying them, he wasn't sure where to keep them, so the following year he loaned them to Disney World in Florida, where they could be seen on a spinning pedestal inside a bulletproof case by the queue for the Great Movie Ride, where millions of children could see them each year.
I could have put them in my living room, I could have kept them locked up in a bank vault, but that would not give me any pleasure, and that would not fulfill my desire of owning the ruby slippers, which is to preserve the magic.
They were there until the year 2000, when he sold them at an auction for $666,000 to a Hollywood shop memorabilia owner, David Elkaby. Those shoes, as far as we know, are still owned by him and locked away in a bank vault somewhere, especially now when their value by affiliation just skyrocketed. Which leaves us with the main star of the show, the fifth pair. It is the last known pair from the ones Kent Warner had found, and he sold it for $2,500 to his friend and fellow collector, Michael Shaw.
I will be grateful to him for my dying day. He put them on the table. God. He couldn't talk.
Since the 80s, he would show them all over the country as a part of his traveling Michael Shaw's Hollywood on Tour, and would therefore be nicknamed as the Traveling Shoes. As mentioned, however, by 1989, people had caught up to the great value of film memorabilia, so that year marked the first attempt to steal the slippers, unsuccessfully. In the following decade, the market itself and the interest for the shoes exploded, so partially for safety reasons, Michael Schaal decided to loan them to Judy Garland's museum in her hometown, where they could be seen by as many of her fans as possible. In 2005, however, the nickname of the shoes would change from the traveling ones to the stolen.
The slippers were exhibited on top of this pedestal.
Someone had smashed through the back door at night.
So he used a handheld sledgehammer.
The police said they were in and out in 2 minutes.
We're a small town museum. We had security, but there were many lapses.
They grabbed the shoes and took off.
It was almost a perfect storm, and you might say a comedy of errors.
For years, it seemed like they had vanished into thin air. But the investigation never stopped, and the local police continued to chase down every single lead.
So there were lots of different speculations.
Everything from they are nailed to a wall in a roadside diner in Missouri, to I was with my boyfriend when he threw them into a water-filled iron ore pit.
A decade later, with no trace of the shoes, an anonymous donor offered $1 million reward for anyone who could offer any sort of information, but that went nowhere either. The FBI was also involved, and eventually, 13 years after they were first stolen, on September 4, 2018, it was announced they had been recovered in a string operation.
We're here today to share with you the recovery of one of the most significant and cherished pieces of movie memorabilia in American history.
But we're not done. This is an ongoing investigation, so we won't talk about the facts, and we will follow those facts where they lead.
They also had to make absolutely sure they're authentic, and as luck would have it, the key to that was in the Smithsonian, because as it turns out, those two pairs were mismatched during production. After an extensive examination by a forensic expert, they managed to confirm that the ones they had recovered were indeed legitimate. But who stole the ruby slippers? And why? Was it an inside job, an insurance scam, or some sort of an elaborate heist? The answer came 5 years later.
A senior citizen has now pleaded guilty to stealing the famous ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz.
The person behind it was a 76-year-old career criminal, Terry Martin, who had basically retired from crime but got talked into one last hit. At first, he says, he declined the invitation to participate in the heist, but old habits die hard, and the thought of a final score kept him up at night. Interestingly enough, according to his lawyer, he had no idea about the cultural significance of the slippers and had never seen The Wizard of Oz. And not just that, but his accomplices, the people who talked him into it, believed that the shoes were made from real rubies. That's the whole reason they stole them. And 2 days later, when they realized they're not, they got rid of them by burying them in a plastic box.
I believe that they got something that was too hot to move. And they were very specific, they were identifiable, so then they had to sit on them.
And with that, after all the drama, after all those years, after everything that happened, the FBI finally reunited the ruby slippers with Michael Schaal.
It's like welcoming back an old friend that I haven't seen in years.
By now, the shoes were an absolute staple of cinema history and pop culture in general. But for Michael Schaal, it was time to say goodbye.
I'm hoping that whoever buys them has the courtesy to loan them to a museum or put them on display somewhere where people can enjoy them.
We have no idea who bought them and no idea what's next. We also don't know if during the spring of 1970, on that fateful day, Kent Warner had found an extra pair that is still hidden somewhere. Unless...
Ha 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 ha!